Tonight, our guest is Dr. Thon Boves, who is an associate professor of avian ecology at Arkansas State University. He has studied a broad range of topics in bird ecology, behavior, evolution, and conservation for over 15 years, often focusing on warblers like cerulean warblers, but also dabbling in raptors and other songbirds. And tonight he'll be talking about the Prothonotary Warbler. Take it away, Thon.
Thank you very much, Dan. And thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to talk about this. This is a study that we just finished up. And so I'm going to be talking about one pretty specific study. So we do a lot of work with prothonotaries, and there'll be a few other little bits of some of our research tucked in here as well. But I am going to be talking mostly about this one study that just got published in a journal just about a month ago. And so it's pretty hot off the presses, but we've been working on it for years. And actually, this is the first time I have presented this material. Usually it's my grad students that present this. And so hopefully I don't butcher it too much, but Joe Utes is the lead author on this research. And he's usually the one that presents. And so I hope I can do it justice. And with that in mind, before I get into a lot of the research, I want to, rather than saving this for the end, hold on 1 second, there you go. Rather than saving this for the end, as we do sometimes with these talks, I'm going to start out with the acknowledgements because really Joe was the driving force behind this research. And this research involves a ton of collaborators. You may have seen that author list, but there's no way we could have done this research like a lot of really good science, I think. Can't do it by yourself. You have a ton of collaborators, you have a ton of people that are supporting and helping you along the way, both funding sources, like our funding from NSF, which includes this really cool program called the Superb program. And then down in the corner here, this is the Prothonotary Warbler Working Group. It's a group of scientists and students from a number of universities that I'll mention again later on, from across the United States and actually Colombia as well. This is Nick Bailey from Selva, which is a bird conservation organization in Colombia. And we have come together to form this group that focuses on conservation of Prothonotary warblers, but we dabble in lots of other areas related to more basic biology and ecology. And in the end, try to put this all together to provide the best information for the conservation of this species, and then hopefully other species that use the same sort of habitats, both on the breeding grounds and on the migratory and wintering grounds. There is a link down here to the Prothonotary Warbler Working Group website, which Eric Johnson, who is with Louisiana Audubon, is kind of our informal leader. And so we have Audubon, and there's also another, he's not in this picture, but Matt Johnson from South Carolina Audubon and Francis Beadler Forest. Both of them play big roles in this group, and it's been really awesome to work with both academics, nonprofits, and lots of students as well. We also required samples from museums for this study as well, and so we took advantage of the amazing collections that are available across this country and beyond. In this case, we just used collections from the United States, but without those, some of our research certainly wouldn't have occurred. And while we don't do a lot of egg collecting anymore, we used eggs that were collected as far back as 1865. And actually most of the eggs that are in collections now are incredibly old, 100 years plus, since collecting now is a little more frowned upon. And then we also had a lot of field techs that were not the lead grad students or main investigators that without them we wouldn't have been able to get this work done either. And so with that, you can either give them most of the credit or most of the blame for what I'm going to present next. All right, so for some of you, you may have heard of Bergmann's rule before, but if you haven't, I'll quickly introduce it. Bergmann's rule is actually one of the oldest of ecological principles. We call it a classic ecogeographic principle. It was coined Bergmann's rule because it was a German scientist who came up with it, and actually came up with it before Darwin's Origin of Species, so before a lot of thought about evolution occurred. And the basic principle that goes into Bergmann's rule is the idea that latitude and body size are positively correlated. So you find larger things farther north, and you find smaller things farther south. And Bergmann wrote his original manuscript in German, and scientific articles from that time period were not the concise things that we have today. They were these long, flowery pages and pages and pages, sometimes hundreds of pages in some cases. And this is all written in German, and it was even with people that speak German today, apparently some of the way that he wrote is difficult to translate in some cases. And so there's been a lot of translations of this work, not always 100% sure exactly what he meant. But in general, it was pretty clear that Bergmann was pointing out a pattern that they saw in most endotherms, where you have, and endotherms being mammals and birds, where you have these warm-blooded organisms that when you go farther north, you find larger individuals, and when you go farther south, you find, or I should say, farther from the equator, so you can go either direction, you find smaller individuals. And this is mainly explained by Bergmann through this idea of heat conservation. And it has to do with surface area to volume ratio. This is going to be some maybe intro to biology stuff or intro to ecology possibly. But larger things in general can maintain their body temperature more easily than small things. And so if you're really big and you live farther north, you don't have to eat as much food per unit of body mass to maintain that body temperature. And so if you're a bird, for instance, and you have to maintain your body temperature at 102 degrees Fahrenheit, it might be really beneficial to you to not have to eat as much food to maintain that body temperature, at least food per unit of body mass. And if you're smaller, more heat is escaping from your body, and you're going to have to keep eating more and more and more. And actually, in Bergmann's original paper, he mostly talked about interspecific patterns, meaning if you looked at all owls, and you looked at where the center of that owl's distribution was, you would see that larger owls typically have a more northerly distribution, and smaller species of owls have typically a more southerly distribution. And while that is overall pretty much true, it turns out that you see the pattern even more strongly intraspecifically. So within, say, great horned owls, you find much larger great horned owls farther north, and you find much smaller great horned owls farther south. So what drives this relationship that has now pretty much withstood the test of time, and it's one of the few ecological principles that hasn't been dismissed in one way or the other. Now, it's not 100% all the time in every situation, but it covers a large percentage of endotherms on Earth. And so what drives this relationship? And these are some mutually exclusive explanations for what drives this pattern. And of course, there's the first one that we probably mostly think of, genetics and evolution. If you have some sort of benefit to being larger at farther, at higher latitudes, and that size of body is driven by genetics, at least in part, then you would imagine that evolution, natural selection, would push organisms to become larger farther north. And for those that don't really need to be larger, there's no need to just put on mass for no reason. And so those that are farther south never get as big. And so birds that live in colder environments gain more benefits from being larger, and this works for mammals as well. Now, there could be a little bit more to this as well. It could be that heat conservation plays a role, but it also could be that for migrants, for instance, if you have to fly a longer distance, so say your breeding grounds are up in Canada and you winter in South America, potentially being larger may give you an advantage in completing that journey more often than not. And so you could possibly gain in both regards. Now, there's also the case that resources could be playing a role as well. And so, for instance, if you're an organism that lives at higher latitudes, you may get more resources per individual, which will allow you to grow larger or have your babies grow larger when the breeding season's occurring. Let me get some pictures up here. Oops, sorry. Then there's also the possibility that there are some constraints. Not sure what there was a picture on here, I thought, but and this constraint could be related to the lower latitude birds that potentially at high temperatures, development could be potentially limited when you reach some sort of critical threshold of temperature, which may lead to birds being smaller, even if that isn't necessarily the optimal size for those individuals at those latitudes. All right, sorry, I finally got a picture in there. I don't know what happened on the last page, but and so as I've mentioned, this has been around for a long time, so you can imagine that people have studied this across a lot of different species and a lot of different organisms and a lot of different environmental contexts. And that's true. There's been about 76 different species that have been looked at closely to see if they match up with this Bergmann's rule, and it's probably even higher than that now. There was a review paper a number of years back, and about 76% of those species, same number as interestingly of the, and actually it was 100, I think was the actual number. So 76 out of 100 showed that there was this pattern of larger birds farther north and smaller birds farther south. But most of those were resident species, which makes sense. Right? If you're a species that spends the entire year in northern Canada, there's a lot more pressure on you to be able to withstand very cold, extremely cold temperatures than if you're a bird that migrates, that your life history strategy is, well, I leave when it gets really cold, so there's no reason for me to get really big because I'm going somewhere where the conditions are less extreme, more benign, and you don't have to worry about growing bigger over evolutionary time. And so what about migrant species? It's definitely been shown in migrant species that there are patterns. There's been some studies with vireos, including this mesmerizing white-eyed vireo here, that show that there is, even within migrant species, there is a pattern of larger birds living farther north, breeding farther north, and smaller birds breeding farther south, which I guess is somewhat surprising, as I just mentioned, because they have, in general, taken the strategy of leaving the areas that get really cold for more benign, less extreme temperatures in the tropics, for instance. But really, it's been somewhat understudied, and we haven't looked a lot at migrant species and how their body sizes are related to the areas they breed. And the other gap that exists with our understanding of Bergmann's rule in birds in particular, and actually beyond birds, pretty much all the research that has been conducted in relation to this pattern that was documented almost now, 175 years ago, has been conducted on adults. So we've looked at adults and we've seen how the adults match up with this pattern, and then tried to understand the ecological and evolutionary implications by only looking at one life stage in these organisms' lives. And as we were thinking about this, we thought, well, maybe those early life stages could really give us some idea of why this pattern exists, especially maybe for migrant species, where it doesn't really make sense as much that adults would need to be larger farther from the equator where temperatures are colder, because they're not there during the really cold time of the year. And especially in birds, which have amazing insulative structures called feathers, you might not think that it's all that necessary for them to grow bigger to maintain their body temperature in these regions. So we wanted to try to understand this a little bit more, and we started to think about this a little bit. We started to ask the question, when does this relationship appear? When can we start seeing Bergmann's rule expressed in a migratory species? And then if we do see it at earlier ages, what would be the benefits that would be accruing at those ages? And so, as I mentioned, we don't really know exactly when this pattern first appears during development. Does it appear in eggs? Now, eggs are not endothermic, but certainly they are still temperature sensitive. They need to be maintained at temperatures that are much higher than the ambient conditions most of the time, over 100 degrees. And so to not have a bunch of eggs dying and the development stopping within the egg, they need to be able to maintain their temperature. And we might say, well, birds incubate, and that's true. But even females typically leave for periods of time to go feed themselves for bouts at different times of the day. And if they're doing that, those eggs can't drop below some critical temperature for very long, or else those developing embryos will not survive. And so you might think that those same sort of thermodynamic principles should apply. And as I mentioned, those eggs rely on their parents, typically the mother, but in some cases the father as well, for maintaining those temperatures appropriately. Once the eggs hatch, you then have these juveniles. And this is also a really sensitive period. At this point, those birds need to maintain their body temperature pretty close to the same temperature that an adult bird does. And again, that could be 106 degrees or around there, depending on the species. And so this is a really sensitive period. And you may have heard the terms altricial and precocial in terms of how birds develop. And so birds can develop in a number of ways, from naked babies that have their eyes closed, that are at the complete mercy of the environment and rely on their parents for warmth, for everything. Or they can be precocial, where they jump out of the egg and they have downy feathers. They can already run a little bit, think of like a killdeer or plover. But these altricial young especially are really at a period of very sensitive fragility. If they are left without the parent brooding them to keep them warm for very long, they can easily succumb and suffer mortality. So they're not able to thermoregulate on their own because they don't have those insulative feathers until they are at least 4 or 5 days old. So those first few days are really critical for them to be able to survive. And even short periods of extreme cold can mean the death of these birds. And of course, they also can't go get food on their own to heat their bodies. And so they really are at the mercy of their parents to provide for them. And you can imagine under situations where you have a cold snap and a parent has to decide, am I going to feed myself to keep myself alive? Because of course they are still having to maintain their own survival as well. Or am I going to spend all my time brooding my young or looking for food for my young to help them develop more rapidly? Sorry. So there's these kind of unanswered questions, and there's these intriguing things that we know about how birds develop that have led us to think like, well, I think maybe there's more to this than we know so far. Even though this thing's been around for a long time, this principle has been around for a long time, maybe there's more to answer and to understand about how this works. And when we were deciding to do this project, we started thinking about another intriguing aspect of this. And that is that none of this is static. This is all dynamic. Benefits of being large at one time in one place doesn't mean that it's always going to be beneficial to be large across space and across time. And so we started thinking about this from the perspective of climate change. And while we were doing this study, a really amazing long-term study came out that was done with some friends and colleagues at the Field Museum that they had 50 plus years of window collision birds that had run into buildings in Chicago, and they had hundreds of individuals of some species, in some cases thousands of individuals of species, and they went out and they started measuring these birds to look at if body size had changed over the past 50 years. And over and over and over, what they found is that in almost every species, birds were getting smaller. So birds have gotten smaller over time, over and over and over across many, many species. And they attributed this to the overall pattern of climate change across the globe. This map here shows how climate change is predicted to proceed across the globe. And you can see lots of reds on here. There's lots of areas that are going to get warmer, as you guys are probably all familiar with. But you will also notice that it's not equivalent. Not every part of the globe is going to change at the same rate. And so while this study that they did definitely showed that there was an overall pattern of birds getting smaller, it didn't take into account the fact that this is not going to be, and it hasn't occurred equally across the globe. What you'll see is that farther north, you have much larger changes in temperature than you have farther south. And so you have this differential warming across space. You have these extreme changes in the polar regions especially. So those high latitudes are warming faster, and they're predicted to continue to warm faster. And so we thought about this, and we thought, well, maybe this means that this could actually result in the relaxation of Bergmann's rule, or maybe eventually the disappearance of Bergmann's rule. If individuals are no longer gaining the benefits of being large farther north, why would they continue to be large? Why would they waste the energy to turn themselves into something large if it's not really that beneficial? And just like Weeks et al. Found, we wanted to see if we could actually pick out a signal of a relaxation of the body size climb. And the only way to do this, though, is to be able to look back in time. And we don't have a bunch of data from organisms back in time, but we can use museum specimens, just as Weeks and those guys did, to try to study this possibility. And so, you know, museums are amazing repositories of data that are just waiting for questions like this to come about to try to answer. And so we wanted to take advantage of museum specimens to try to study the possibility that Bergmann's rule, while classic and seems like it can explain a whole bunch of things, may be in the process of changing as well. And so to answer these questions and kind of fill these knowledge gaps, we chose a species that we have been studying for years, and it turns out is also a really great study species for these questions, and that's the Prothonotary Warbler. Possibly the most beautiful warbler, incredibly bright. You can't capture their brilliance in a photo too often. But for those of you that have seen one, you know that they are, when you get one in your binoculars, they're amazing birds to look at. And I've had the great fortune to be, now I've been studying them for pretty much my whole time in Arkansas. So it's almost 7 years now. And for this question, we think they're an ideal species for a number of reasons. First of all, they are a long distance migrant. And so that kind of fills that gap of what's going on with migrants. And they have a relatively wide breeding range, from latitudinally especially, from central Wisconsin along the Mississippi River Valley down to the Gulf, and then to the Atlantic coast, and up through the kind of foothills of the Appalachians to a certain extent. By far their center of their distribution is in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. There's some estimates of 30% of the population living in Louisiana, for instance. So that is really where the core of their population is. But you know, you go up to Wisconsin, you can find them really packed in along the Mississippi River bottoms up there as well. The other thing that's really interesting about them is, this is some of the research that we've done on their migratory pattern. Down here is their wintering grounds, and by using devices called geolocators, we put them out on a lot of these same locations, and we were able to collect data on where these birds go in the winter. And 95% of the birds that we marked and tagged, which was about 45 birds, somewhere around there, went to Colombia. And then a few of them went to Panama as well. So Colombia and Panama, they have a really narrow distribution during the wintering season, which for this question is really useful, because now you don't have that confounding factor of, well, maybe they winter in different areas, and the wintering grounds is what's driving the body size pattern. In this case, they are really highly concentrated, and these are all lowlands also. So altitude, as you might have guessed, can also potentially change body size as well. And so higher altitudes potentially could lead to larger birds as well, for the same reasons, heat conservation possibly. But in this case, these are all lowland birds. They're either mangroves, or this is now considered a hot spot for Prothonotary Warbler wintering, the Magdalena River Valley in northern Colombia. And so they have this really concentrated wintering range as well. And then the other thing that's great about them is they are a cavity nester. of all the warblers in the United States, only 2 of them are cavity nesters, Prothonotary warblers, and then in the Western US, Lucy's warblers. And so the thing that's great about that is we have access to all the life stages that we wanted to study. And not only are they cavity nesters, you can put up artificial boxes and they will use them quite readily. And so we have these nesting box colonies that we can study these birds really easily and get access to all of the different age classes of these birds as they develop, from eggs to tiny little baby nestlings to really cute older nestlings to adults. And we have access to both males and females, which is also somewhat unusual in these studies, because usually the males are really easy to catch and the females are really hard. In this case, we can get access to both of them. And then finally, we have this amazing group of people that were already studying Prothonotary warblers, and we can work with them on all sorts of different questions. And you can see the different institutions that are involved here. This is the Prothonotary Warbler Working Group again: Ohio State, Arkansas State, Selva and Columbia, Virginia Commonwealth, University of Memphis, Audubon, Louisiana, Western Illinois University, and Audubon, South Carolina. And so it's just an amazing group of researchers that allowed this sort of research to occur. And so what were our goals of this study? As you might have figured out already, one, we wanted to test to see if we could document Bergmann's rule in Prothonotary warblers, and we wanted to see if we could document it across all life stages, or we wanted to see where it started to manifest itself. Is it present in all life stages, or do you only see it in adults? And then finally, the second part, we wanted to compare historical and contemporary samples. And in this case, we started with eggs, and I'll talk about that later on, but in this case, we used historical eggs and contemporary eggs to see if we could detect any change in this pattern over time. And so here's where we sampled birds. These blue spots in this map show all the locations where we collected samples of different life stages. So from the very, very southern part of Louisiana up to the upper Mississippi River Valley, where there's big bluffs and it's a really cool environment, but you get down by the river and you get a lot of Prothonotary still. Oops. And then we also looked longitudinally as well. And so we had sites down in South Carolina, Virginia, and then Ohio. And so we had this very big north-south gradient here, but then we also had some east-west differentiation as well. And this span from about 29 to 44 degrees latitude. And if you're wondering about temperature in these areas, there's really not a huge difference. You know, these birds start breeding really a lot months earlier in Louisiana than they do in Wisconsin. And so when they get there, the temperature in Louisiana isn't all that much different than the temperature when they get to Wisconsin. But here's the big caveat there. There are still cold snaps in Wisconsin, despite the fact that the average temperature is pretty close to what the average temperature is in Louisiana at that point. You don't get sudden below freezing cold snaps in Louisiana in April, right? It doesn't happen. But you regularly get those in May in Wisconsin. And so that's a really important aspect of this, we think, at this point. And then one other bit of information, we've also done some genetic work on Prothonotary warblers. And just keep this in mind, I talked about genetics driving this body size thing. Our first study on genetics in Prothonotary warblers showed very little difference between the northern sites and the southern sites. It actually showed more difference between these Atlantic coast birds and these Mississippi River Valley birds. And so, you know, right off the bat there, it would seem like, well, maybe genetics don't play a role if we do find something, but we'll talk more about that later as well. All right, so what did we do? We went out and here's an example of the nest boxes. We use milk cartons, and we create these boxes that last several years, and they're really cheap and they're really easy, and you can get students to make them. You don't really need many tools, and then you put these things up and you can take off that top really easily, and you have access to the birds really easily. And so we did this during the 2018 and 19 breeding seasons. And then we sampled eggs before incubation had begun, which at least three eggs per clutch. We sampled nestlings, both early, which we considered days 1 to 3, and then late, which we considered days 7 through 9, which we also recorded the date which we sampled. And then we also sampled the adults, both sexes, and we also included second-year birds and after second-year birds. So second-year birds are birds that are in their first breeding season or potentially in their first breeding season, meaning that they were born the previous year. And after second-year birds just mean they were born sometime earlier than that. Unfortunately, we can't age the birds any more accurately than that. And so we were kind of stuck with just 2 age classes for adults. And so what we did is we opened those tops of those boxes. We reached in and very carefully removed eggs. We took photos of the eggs with rulers to be able to later measure these things on computers. And so we were able to use computer programs to calibrate and then get width and length measurements. And then we very carefully put those eggs back in. I can honestly say we didn't have a single clutch abandoned. We did have some clutches that not all the eggs hatched. Whether or not that was in relation to what we did, I would be surprised if it was, because that happens even if we don't take any eggs out. Sometimes eggs are infertile, sometimes eggs aren't incubated properly, and sometimes they don't hatch. But in general, we seem to not have much impact on the hatching success or the overall nest success by doing this. Same thing with the little nestlings. Once incubation was complete, we very, very carefully removed those nestlings and we weighed them. It's a lot easier for nestlings. Getting structural measurements like with rulers is really difficult because they're kind of curled up and it's hard to get them. You can't really stretch them out. But there's a large correlation between structural length measurements and weight. So we just weighed the birds and we used that as our body size measurement. And then eventually, so we did the same thing with older nestlings. So this is a nestling that's 2 days old. Then we did the same thing with older nestlings. And we did 7 to 9 because if you do it after 9, there's a good chance that they won't go back in and they will refuse to leave the nest at that point. And we didn't have any forced fledgings, is what it's called, if we accidentally force the birds to fledge because they think we're predators or something to that effect. And then for the adults, we used what's called target banding. I'm not sure if you can hear this, but we played this. This is the exact track that we use. We have, over the years, perfected the sounds that are most irritating to these birds. These are chip notes that just drive the males wild, and they have to find out who's in their territory. And sometimes you catch a bird within 5 seconds in some cases. And so there you go. There's a Prothonotary Warbler in the net. For the females, all right, stop it. Stop. Here, stop. Okay. Sorry. For the females, this is the aspect that females sometimes respond to those sorts of playback, but a lot of times they don't. What we did is we walked up to the box and we put a mesh bag over the box, and then we kind of tapped on the side of the box, and they'd typically fly into our bag, and then we could measure and get our information that we needed from that bird. One second here. All right, so then we also, as I mentioned before, we also collected information on museum specimens. And so we got collections from 7 natural history collections, and these eggs were collected between 1865 and 1961. So a lot of old eggs that have been maintained here. You can see a clutch of eggs. You know, it's pretty amazing to think that they would collect entire clutches. You know, now we would definitely never do that. Maybe someone would collect 1 or 2 eggs from a clutch, but we never take the entire thing. But it was a different time back then. This was a clutch of eggs that was taken from Oklahoma in 1917. So interesting. And you can see here, it was just an image of what it looks like when we're measuring these eggs and taking the dimensions of these things. They were from about the same latitudinal spread as we collected our contemporary samples. And then, as I mentioned, we use this computer software called ImageJ to measure these eggs. I'm not going to spend hardly any time on this page, but just let you know, we built some models. We looked at the strength of evidence for these different variables to explain egg size and body mass. And then we also accounted for confounding variables like the eggs came from the same clutch, the year that the eggs were collected, the age of the bird, and other things like that. And so I'm not going to go into that in much detail. If someone wants to ask a question about this modeling stuff, we can talk about it afterwards. But I don't want to bore people too much. All right, let's get to the results. All right, so what do we find? We'll start with the nestlings, and I'll explain why we didn't start with the eggs in a second. All right, so nestlings. Over here we have body mass on the y-axis and latitude on the x-axis, and what we see here is a increase in body mass, and this is actually the whole brood. So it was really hard to measure these things individually, and so we measured the whole brood together, and then just controlled for the number of nestlings that were in that brood. And so this is the entire brood together. Then for the older birds, same thing for the older birds. We included them all together to make it easier and quicker when we are weighing these things. Otherwise, it took a lot of time. And as I mentioned before, these things are somewhat fragile, and so we wanted to measure them with as much accuracy, but without causing any undue mortality on them. But overall, what you see is the pattern was what we would expect from Bergmann's rule. With latitude, size increases. So with latitude, size increases. There's a lot of variation here in this line here, as you can see. That's because some of these are day ones and these are day three. We controlled for that in our modeling, statistical modeling. But in general, we saw that pattern occurring both at early ages and late nestlings. These p-values are just showing the strength of the statistical relationship. So a very low p-value means that there's very little chance that this is just randomly, we randomly found this pattern and it really doesn't exist. And so both early nestlings and late nestlings saw that pattern, that farther north, larger birds, farther south, smaller birds. Adults, same thing, both males and females. We saw this pattern of, now these are individuals. We saw this pattern of larger birds farther north, smaller birds farther south. You'll see that females are heavier, and that's an interesting aspect of migrant breeding ecology as well, that typically males are larger, and we think of that in birds for the most part, except for things like raptors. But it turns out that during the breeding season, these migrant females have to put on so much weight to go through the rigors of reproduction that they are putting their body through. And so during the breeding season, the females are actually larger than the males. By the time migration comes along, this has switched, and the males become larger than the females. But in this case, during the breeding season, the females were larger, and we saw that pattern again from smaller birds farther south and larger birds farther north. And now we get to the eggs, and I'll start with the historic eggs. And I'm just showing you egg length here. And once again, we saw a statistical pattern of larger eggs farther north and smaller eggs farther south, as would match up with what we would predict based on Bergmann's rule. But then we look at our modern eggs, our contemporary eggs. And this is where things get interesting and probably bring up more questions than answers. Well, we found the reverse pattern in our contemporary eggs. We found that farther south, the eggs were larger, and farther north, the eggs were smaller. And there's a lot of interesting aspects to this. And I'll try to discuss some of them with you as I get into the next section, but you may have more questions, and I hope you do. Okay, so when we take all these results and we think about them, what do we find, right? And what are the overall conclusions, and then what are some of the kind of interesting takeaways / implications for what we found? So first of all, we found that Bergmann's rule was exhibited in both the historic eggs and the nestlings. And so it seems like, especially based on the early nestlings, there's probably some genetic component to it, which isn't that surprising. We've found genes that control body size in other organisms. Now, even though in our previous genetic work, we didn't find a latitudinal pattern of differentiation in the genetics from the birds that live farther north from the birds that live farther south, we did not design our study to look for specific genetics. And so there is possibilities that we can use knowledge of the genes that control body size in other organisms and do a more targeted approach to look for differentiation in these genes north to south in prothonotaries. And I think probably the most interesting part of this all, and the thing that in my opinion probably is really responsible for driving a lot of Bergmann's rule in migratory species, is this potential for mortality risk of not the adults getting too cold and dying when they have all these great insulative feathers, but of the nestlings. And it doesn't even have to happen every year. It could happen once every 10 years. If you get a really bad cold snap far north and a bunch of little birds die, and only the birds that are just a little bit bigger, a little better at conserving heat, those are the ones that survive those extreme events, that is enough to push this pattern for natural selection to drive this pattern, right? And so we really think that these young organisms may be the key for explaining why we see this pattern in migratory birds. And it just so happens, this just came out a week ago since we published our paper, a new study that has been focusing on tree swallows. And for those of you that haven't kept up with this, tree swallows are a really interesting species that have really pushed their spring arrival date earlier and earlier as climate change and other insect emergence and leaf out have started earlier as well. Tree swallows have kind of matched that pattern, and they have pushed their spring migratory arrival dates up by, and I can't remember the exact number, but a couple of weeks, I think, in some cases. And they're getting to Canada, for instance, weeks earlier than they used to. But while they were doing this study, it turns out there were a few cold snaps that occurred, even though overall the phenology has pushed in a way that makes everything start a little earlier. You can still get these cold snaps even in light of climate change, right? Climate change doesn't mean that there's never going to be any more cold snaps. It means overall the climate is shifting, but you still get these cold snaps. And what they found with tree swallows is that as these tree swallows were getting there earlier and earlier and earlier, there was more nestling mortality occurring because there were still these cold snaps that were occurring at these earlier dates. So overall, it was probably working out pretty well for tree swallows. Otherwise, they wouldn't probably be doing that. But for certain individuals, maybe smaller individuals, for instance, there might not be that process of migrating earlier might not be as beneficial. And so they're actually seeing this increased nesting mortality as spring migration has moved earlier. And so this fits up with what we are suggesting the benefits of being larger farther north is for these migratory species. There's still the question of resource availability. And in the north, when you have long days, you have a whole lot of photosynthesis occurring. You have these huge explosions of protein in the form of insects. There certainly could be some resource availability aspect to this as well that helps drive some of these patterns. But those really young nestlings have barely been fed anything yet. And so I still think there's probably some genetic components to it as well. And we actually do have data on this that we're going to be analyzing. We did a whole bunch of provisioning videos, which are the parents feeding the nestlings. And so we did that across our study sites as well. And so we'll be able to analyze that a little bit. All right, so then we get to the more complicated stuff that I don't have all the answers for. This reversal of what we'll call Bergmann's rule with the eggs. We saw the reverse pattern where we had smaller eggs farther north and larger eggs farther south, which is really hard to explain, especially in light of the fact that the nestlings farther north were still larger. So we were getting smaller eggs producing larger nestlings. And we really do not have a good answer to this at this point. I'm just going to throw out a whole bunch of potential avenues of research that we'd like to go down to try to understand what could be responsible for this. And I will start out, we don't really know a lot about eggs. It's amazing. We do know a lot about the components of eggs, but we don't really know a lot about the life history strategies of what drives the exact components in one population's eggs versus another population's eggs. We don't even really know how different population egg components differ. But I will say this is probably a really complicated, we call it adaptive landscape. There's all sorts of different pressures, environmental pressures, predator pressures, seasonal temperature pressures that are pushing on these birds that probably numerous different things could be implicated there. And so some of the things that we think potentially could be playing a role in this include variation in incubation efficiency across different clutches and egg sizes across latitudes. In general, birds farther north lay larger clutches, so they usually lay up 1 or 2 more eggs per clutch, which in general means that it's harder to incubate all those eggs efficiently. And so if you could potentially have slightly smaller eggs, there may be a benefit to doing that. Potentially differences in nest characteristics. There's different materials that are available for nests, and those different materials could have different insulative properties. So if in Wisconsin, for instance, there's a moss that is incredibly insulative, you know, I'm just making something up here, but potentially there could be nest characteristics that help explain this. We know that the female body size is different from north to south, and so potentially female body size is also playing a role here. And then the one that we're hoping to study next is what happens if you incorporate different amounts of yolk, albumin, different nutrients within those eggs that potentially could lead to larger nestlings coming out of smaller eggs. We don't really know. We know that there is variation in egg size. We know there's variation in egg size and the contents of eggs for other species in some cases, but we don't know how that varies geographically. No one studied it in any species ever. And so we're actually hoping to do that next, to look to see, is there a difference in what Prothonotary warblers in Wisconsin put in their eggs versus what Prothonotary warblers in Louisiana put in their eggs, for instance? And how does that then influence the size of the nestlings that come out and the developmental process? And we'll finish up by just mentioning that we also saw this in all adults. And so, you know, when you think about this, when I mentioned that idea of nestlings kind of driving this pattern, maybe it's that the adults just, you know, big nestlings lead to big adults. And so they're just carrying on that large body size without really, you know, there's no cost associated with it, but maybe they're not getting all that much benefit either. But as I mentioned before, it could also be associated with migratory distance. Those birds in Wisconsin are flying farther than those birds in Louisiana. And so being larger potentially could provide them with a little bit of extra oomph to make it across the Gulf of Mexico, for instance, after already flying all the way from Wisconsin to Louisiana. And then another question that this brings up is an interesting one. You know, the birds that are born in Louisiana, they're not all the same size. They're not all exactly the same size. There's variation in Louisiana. There's variation all over the place. And so we're curious to think about potentially the fact that maybe those birds, the larger birds that are born in Louisiana, the next generation or the next time they come back to their breeding grounds, they're the ones that disperse a little farther north. And it would be really interesting to document that pattern. It's a really hard thing to document because relocating birds that you banded in a nest the next year is almost impossible, or if you do, you only find them at your site. But it would be kind of interesting to see if we could figure out a way to follow these young birds and see if the larger nestlings come back and go farther north, and the smaller nestlings stay farther south. And so future directions that we want to go down next, we want to try to understand a little more of how genetics controls these body sizes versus food resources. It's that the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Which one is driving this? The greater food resources in the north, the genetics, is it a combination of both? Probably. And then we also want to start to understand a little bit more how general this pattern is across species. Did we just happen to pick a species that shows this, or is it, if we studied 10 different species, would 9 of them show this same sort of pattern? And then, as I mentioned, we really want to do some studies on egg composition. We want to look across latitude to see how egg composition differs. There's been a little bit of work with pied flycatchers in Europe, but it's across a relatively short latitudinal span, and they really didn't get into egg composition. They looked at egg size and some variety of other things, but not into the nitty-gritty details of egg composition and what that means then. There is some research now that is starting to go on with eastern kingbirds to look at some of these same things. And interestingly, in eastern kingbirds, you see a different pattern. You see egg size varying north to south, larger eggs farther north, smaller eggs farther south, but you don't see the pattern in adults. Larger kingbirds do not live farther north than smaller than kingbirds in the south. And so you have a different pattern in this case. And it's interesting to think about why kingbirds are open cup nesters. Pied flycatchers are nest box or nest cavity users as well. And then, you know, one thing that we really wish we had done in this study, but we didn't, and that is to look at adult body size as well as egg size using museum specimens. Now, I'll tell you the main reason we didn't do this. Wing chord, so you can measure wing size, but wing chord is not a very good measurement because it's at the mercy of wear, and wing size sometimes changes outside of, or in its own way, outside of body mass. So for instance, in that weak study that I mentioned where all these birds were getting smaller and smaller and smaller, their wings were actually getting larger and larger. And so what they were using to measure adult body size was tarsus length, and so that's a bone in their leg. And these tarsus measurements are really difficult to do with live birds. They're not too bad to do with museum specimens where you can have the same person do it over and over and over. But tarsus length in the field with many different observers is notoriously unreliable. And so that's why we did not include a structural measure, and we stuck with body mass, because you put a bird on a scale, there's no chance that an observer is going to, you know, move a ruler slightly differently or a caliper slightly differently. And so we just stuck with body mass. But we really would like to look at adult body size to see if we can pick out the same sort of pattern. Obviously, we didn't see a reversal of Bergmann's rule, but maybe we'd see, if we look at historical specimens, we'd see that slope getting flatter. So maybe it used to be really steep with northern birds, much, much larger. Now northern birds are just a little bit larger. We don't know. And so we do want to try to look at that as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again for having me. And I would be really, really happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Thanks, Don. So folks, you can type your question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. There are a few questions in the chat box that I will relay to Don, but I wanted to start off with a question: is what percent difference are we talking about in all the different species that have been studied and show to follow Bergmann's rule?
So like, so you're asking what percent change from latitude?
Body size, yeah.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I will say though, in our study, and I have to look back at the paper for sure, but we had about for the adults, we saw about a 0.1 gram per latitude change. And so like the birds in central Wisconsin were in general about 1.5 grams larger than the birds in Louisiana, which is about 10%, somewhere around there, 10% larger, maybe 15% in some cases. But I don't know across other species. I think in some cases it's greater than that. So like residents, I would bet, have a much steeper gradient from north to south. But I honestly don't know the answer to that. But we did see, and we saw about the same percent difference in the nestlings also, from farthest south to our farthest north birds.
Okay, thanks.
How do I see the chat box? Are you going to ask me, Dan?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
So John wants to know, has an analysis of the shell material yielded any valuable information on ecology and feeding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. You know, and then so people have used shells for a number of studies involving, I think, diet as well. But I don't know how much people have looked like at shell composition across space to see if you can identify differences in say food resources. I'm not 100% sure.
I was thinking, Tom, that you could, by seeing the materials used in the shell, you could estimate shell strength and therefore survival rate, plus the fact that you could estimate insulation ability, and you could estimate how good or bad on a very broad sort of band the nutrition was for the birds. All three, just looking at the elements in there.
That's an interesting, you know, I don't really know how much we know about eggshell composition varying across space either. It's an interesting idea. I'm going to look into that because I honestly don't know. I mean, would there be a correlation between the composition of eggshell? And the eggshell doesn't have as much variation. You know, there's all sorts of probably micro chemicals in there that are incorporated, possibly unintentionally in some cases, incidentally as the shell is being produced. But that's interesting to think about. I don't know if anyone's done that but it sounds cool to me. Certainly they measure egg thickness. You know, they can measure egg thickness, and that is an interesting aspect that, yeah, maybe, you know, those birds farther north have thicker eggshells than farther south. Certainly we know across species there's difference. So cowbirds are famous for having extra strong eggshells that are super strengthened, because the idea is that they need to protect them from the pecking of their host that would otherwise be able to destroy their egg. And so by making their eggshells stronger, they can defend against the likelihood of a bird pecking their egg and killing their nestling. And so there's certainly precedent to know that, and certainly across species, we know there's lots of variation in eggshell thickness. Within species, I just don't know how much we know about that, but it's interesting to think about for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
John, you want me to ask your follow-up question there? If there's a way to determine what's inside the egg, like the yolk to white ratio, without actually destroying the egg?
Unfortunately, no.
Ultrasonics.
Yeah, I mean, you can probably get vague. You could probably get estimates that are not all that accurate. But to really know things like water content, to really know yolk percentage versus albumin, to really get to like nutrient level scale, you do have to take the egg. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we've already talked about. We don't want to take all the eggs from a single clutch. And really, we don't need a ton of samples. We're talking about like 10 eggs from each site, something like that. And so in the long run, probably having very little impact on the birds, and even in the short run, probably having very little impact on the birds. But that'd be really cool if there was a way that we could get really accurate estimates. I think there are, again, ways to get vague estimates, but we're probably going to be looking at higher resolution than we'd be able to get at using those sorts of techniques.
All right, another question in the chat box. Could excessive heat influence smaller size in nestlings or adults in the south?
Yeah, and so that I mentioned that early on. I didn't come back to that in discussion, but yeah, so that could be another non-mutually exclusive explanation for what we saw. And so heat's a really interesting thing for nestlings. As with most things, there's an optimal temperature. And so in general, when temperatures are warmer, at least in the ecological past, the warmer the temperature, the faster development occurs. And in general, it leads to slightly larger birds. But at some point, everything else being equal, at some point though, you can reach a temperature where development is constrained. And if you have too much heat, development is slowed down, and the bird is then smaller. You know, and so there's been experimental studies with this, with house sparrows, where they raise temperatures artificially above what we normally see where a house sparrow would nest, and they have shown that the body size can decrease. I'd be surprised if I don't think we've reached that point yet, for at least for Prothonotary warblers, in terms of their natural environments. But at some point, I do think that is certainly something that could play a role in this as well. But you know, but you're right, that is also a possibility that we can't rule out.
Does Bergmann's rule apply to altitude as well?
As far as I know, Bergmann did not bring up altitude in his manuscript, but with the underlying heat conservation mechanism, it certainly does. And we know now that if you go up altitude, you see more or less the same pattern as you do when you go up latitude as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if he actually brought up altitude, but it's not a very stretch of the imagination to apply it to altitude as well. But the nice thing about Prothonotaries is all of these birds are at pretty much 0 to at the most 100 feet above sea level or something like that. I mean, it's, you know, it's a very, very narrow range that Prothonotary, they're all in bottomlands, even in the areas in Wisconsin. There's bluffs around them, but they're only found down at the river edges.
So another question in the chat is the trend you see in Prothonotaries, is that affected by the fact that the Prothonotaries are migrants and winter in a relatively small area compared to their breeding range?
Yeah, again, I think it makes them a pretty good species to study, at least for a migratory species, because of the fact that you don't have that confounding variable of a wide wintering range. If you had a big wide wintering range also, and say all the birds from Wisconsin wintered in Bolivia, and all the birds from Louisiana wintered in Colombia, now you're getting to the point where, like, well, maybe it's not the breeding range that's pushing them in one direction or the other. It's something happening on the wintering grounds. Because we have a very small area that they winter in, we've taken out that possibility of the wintering range being what's driving this pattern. And instead we can attribute it most likely to what's happening on the breeding grounds. Now, the thing that we don't know for sure is how migratory ability then also plays into this, because of the fact that those birds in Wisconsin certainly do have to fly farther than those birds in Louisiana. And so it could be that it's not heat conservation, it's the need to migrate farther, you know, so that potentially could explain it better than heat conservation, potentially. I still think heat conservation is playing a role, and I would guess, you know, the best traits, the traits that are selected for the strongest are those traits that fill multiple roles, right? If it helps you migrate farther, it helps you survive cold snaps, and it does something else, those things are really going to be strongly selected for, versus things that are only benefiting you in one or two or a minimal way.
Thanks. Other questions? A couple more questions. I found the variation in wing chord to be interesting, because I would have thought that birds that migrate further, longer distances would have longer wings. You think longer wings would be associated with better flight?
So I have this last slide that I just put at the end here. It turns out that in our birds, wing chord was really highly correlated. So here's wing chord across latitudes as well. And so for ours, and this is notice the flipping of the males and females here also. And so I mentioned how females are larger during the breeding season and then smaller during the winter. You can see that pattern here in the wing chord. Males have longer wings than females, even though they're lighter. And so you can see there's some complicated stuff going on there, but you're right. In this case, wing chord did a pretty good job of explaining it, which, given that, we may be safe just measuring wing chord in museum specimens from adult birds as well to see if that trend line has gotten softer over time.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box.
Great questions. I'm very impressed.
Just one quickie. I noticed that it appears to apply to land birds very well. But if I think of the location of petrels, and I think of the location and their migration, of the location of albatrosses and their lack of migration as far as I know, but I'm not at all knowledgeable. Would it be reasonable to say that the law applies to terrestrial and not maritime?
It's a really good question. Thinking about the, so I mean, in general, water moderates temperatures, right? I mean, there's a lot of areas that are really far north that are warmer than you'd expect because of the fact that you have lots of water and potentially currents that, and so yeah, you have currents that are coming from the south versus the north, Gulf Stream versus Atlantic or Pacific coast currents. I'm just kind of rambling here because I don't know the answer to that. It seems reasonable to expect, in my opinion, that you'd see less of this pattern for oceanic marine species than you would for continental terrestrial species, because of that reason, that there's not as extreme of temperatures over the ocean as there are over land. So I would buy that, but I don't know the answer, and I'd have to go through the data that exists out there to give you any more information. But it seems reasonable to me. I think that's a good prediction.
Just listening, it seemed a possible. Yeah. That's all.
I'd buy that. That'd be interesting. That'd be an interesting comparison also to see if if you're going to look at how land birds have changed over time, compare that to how seabirds have changed over time to see if we see that same pattern. We don't have the sample size of. We don't have the sample size. Seabirds aren't running into buildings as often, so we don't have as much of a sample as they had at the Field Museum. That study from the Field Museum had 70,000 specimens, by the way. So that was the sample size that they were working with.
All right, so I think one last question. I think Emily Boves or someone with her maybe has a question.
Oh boy.
Why do the nestlings' feathers differ from the adults' feathers?
So when the nestlings are growing, the first thing they want to do, so birds have an amazing ability, adult birds have an amazing ability to keep their body warm. And that's because they have special feathers that keep that heat in. The same feathers you have in your sleeping bag, those down feathers. And when a little tiny bird that is at the mercy of the environment, that has to keep its body temperature at 100+ degrees, the first thing it's going to do is grow in those little downy feathers. And so like the little baby killdeers that we've found before, they just have a ton of downy feathers covering their body. And those first babies, the first feathers they grow in a nest, like the Prothonotaries, are going to be those downy feathers to keep their body warm. And then eventually they'll start growing in those also important feathers, the ones that help them fly, the ones that keep water off of them, all the things that eventually they're going to have to be able to do as well. But those downy feathers are first and foremost. They have to come first to keep the little guys warm. Yes, Cora?
Has a male female ever act like a male?
Has a female ever acted like a male?
A Prothonotary.
Yes, it's a very good question. So we actually have studied that also. Sometimes female prothonotaries do act like males, and they are very aggressive, and they sing even. There are some, it's not the same as the male song, but they produce sounds that seem to have the same communication meaning as the males. And they're these very interesting buzzy ascending sounds that they make, and they throw their head back like a male. And so, yeah, some weird, shouldn't call them weird, but some females that think out of the box do act like males sometimes, or what we consider male behavior to be. Good question.
Excellent questions. Don, you're clearly a teacher at home as well as at school. So with that, thank you so much for taking the time to share your interesting research with us, and thanks everyone for joining us. And again, wrapping up this portion, but please stay on for the business portion and social portion of our meeting tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Hopefully I'll see some of you guys at our live stream banding day.
Stay tuned.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks to you.